The topic tonight, of course, is the Dragoons in Iowa. And one of the most common questions we get at the museum when people walk through our military frontier exhibit is what is and what was a Dragoon? The signs, you'll see an example of one that marked the 1835 trail. Basically, the name Dragoon was derived from a short blunderbuss pistol that mounted troops in Europe used. The original Dragoons would ride to the battlefield, dismount, and fight with their short, almost a carbine-sized blunderbuss or a shorter pistol-sized with kind of a trumpet-looking barrel. Some of them, I've not seen an actual example, but according to the literature, some of the barrels were actually cast in the shape of like maybe a dragon with the dragon's mouth open. So when you fired the weapon discharged, you would end up having a little flame coming out of the dragon's mouth. So the pistols earned or were bestowed with the name dragon, and the people that carried these dragon pistols, like a grenade thrower became a grenadier, the dragon carriers became dragoneers, and later that got distilled down to the word dragoon. That's the best definition I found so far. Following the War of 1812, we had cavalry mounted regiments and units in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. They remained on the Army roster up through the War of 1812. In 1815, when the war was over, and the government always has a practice of cutting down the military when the war's over, because we're not going to need to have these people again, and then until the next war rolls along. So the Army divorced themselves, disbanded, struck from the roster the dragoon regiments or cavalry regiments that they had. Well, when the Black Hawk War broke out, many of you that are students of Iowa history know that the Black Hawk War fought very briefly in the summer fair weather months of 1832, ranged from northwestern Illinois up through southwestern Wisconsin. The Army realized that fighting a mobile war was not necessarily suited to the infantry, because the infantry, they march on foot. Dragoons ride on horseback. They can get from A to B faster than an infantry unit can if you're trying to cut off a fleeing band of Indians, which was the case in the Black Hawk War. So that conflict demonstrated the need to the military once again to have a more rapid, mobile, quickly deployable force. The result was that Congress authorized a regiment of U.S. Dragoons, and they were created on 3 March 1833, less than a year after the end of the Black Hawk War, drawing from that example. 3 years later, they authorized a 2nd Dragoon Regiment in May of 1836. The reason for the second one, we're not fighting a war at that time, and we won't for about a decade after that, is that they need a force that can be charged with a number of different missions on the frontier. One is to establish frontier posts and assert U.S. sovereignty. Remember that the frontier at that time is the northwestern states, Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, parts of western Missouri. So this frontier is growing larger it's growing larger in Iowa's neck of the woods as the frontier moves westward. As we negotiated different treaties with the Native Americans, we had to have, the Dragoons served essentially as a police force to make sure that settlers were not transgressing into Indian land, and that Indians weren't migrating back into their traditional areas and hunting grounds. So the job of the Dragoons was to move Indians out of territory that their tribe had sold and move whites out of land that was not yet theirs. So essentially enforce treaty borders. Also to provide protection to both groups, to Indians, to settlers, and to the Indian agents, which are the government representatives that would negotiate claims of Indians and settlers that might develop between the two groups. And then finally explore, survey, and establish travel routes. A year before the Dragoons are created, this is what Iowa looked like in 1832. The eastern half has been surveyed. The original Black Hawk purchase ran about like this. At the end of the Black Hawk War, there was a second Black Hawk purchase. And so you can see in 1832, the state is they're already surveying counties, giving names to them, coming up with county seats, etc. But north to south, if we draw a line, the remainder to the west belonged to the Sioux, belonged to the Winnebago, or neutral, occupying the neutral ground that had been evicted, if you will, from their traditional homes in Wisconsin. And then the Sauk and Fox, and sometimes you'll Sometimes in the period literature and even today's Sauk and Fox is also used interchangeably, but my understanding is incorrectly, and I'm not going to try to explain it because I'll probably confuse you as thoroughly as I sometimes confuse myself, but also sometimes used interchangeable with Meskwaki. But I think the Meskwaki is a smaller group of the Sauk and Fox tribe. And then down here are the Iowas, the namesake of our state, and then Potawatomis here. So there's a very, very large area that needs to be patrolled to keep settlers out and to keep Indians in the lands that they were confined to as a result of territorial sale. So in dragoon missions in Iowa, there were several, 5, 6, 7 dragoons. So we're going to summarize here a little bit. The first one in Iowa took place from September 1834, a very brief one. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Watts Kearney, who later on in the Mexican War would lead the Army of the West, and the Mormon Battalion recruited from Mormon immigrants moving westward out to Utah were recruited. He would lead them out to California. But the units under his command, the dragoons tended to send out patrolling units from a regiment. A regiment, that time, full strength, 500, 600 soldiers or troopers. Sometimes that word is used to describe them as well. So they would tend to send out 3 companies of dragoons per mission. So in this case, Company B, commanded by Captain Nathaniel Boone, who was the son of Daniel Boone, and was the namesake of Boone, Iowa. He would come west and found Boone, Iowa. Company H, Captain Brown, and Company I are the 1st Dragoons. I guess we got, yeah, and Company H, Company I. Their mission was to assist the construction of a fort at the mouth of the Des Moines River along the Mississippi. And so they assisted that construction. The 6th Infantry soldiers had began that project, and they were there to assist and provide protection. So the post, like I said, was named Fort Des Moines, and there would be other ones we'll touch on, but this would be Fort Des Moines number 1. The present-day town of Montrose, Iowa, is very near, if not on, where this original Fort Des Moines number 1 was located. A little bit of a sidebar: Iowa has 5 communities that owe their existence to the prior existence of U.S. Army forts garrisoned by federal troops. If we want to count up the total number of forts in Iowa, temporary, civilian, worried about pending Indian attacks, usually that didn't happen, there were over 50 forts in Iowa. There were 9 U.S. government federal troop garrison forts in Iowa. 5 would become communities that we know today. Des Moines, Montrose would be the first one. This community of Des Moines has its origins with Fort Des Moines number 2, Fort Atkinson, Fort Dodge. Fort Madison was the first one. The Army can be credited with 5 communities that appear on the Iowa map today. This is a period map. It's hard to see. I can't see it standing here, but it's the only one I could find. That's a period map of Fort Des Moines number 1. It had a pretty typical stockade fence, barracks buildings, magazines. Then they had outbuildings and troop quarters on the outside of the fence. Abuts the river there. They don't have to defend that side. They'll see them or hear them splashing across the Mississippi River if they can make it across. And if they had to evacuate, if they had boats, they could evacuate the fort if they needed. That fort existed for about 3 years, and then the frontier moves onward. We'll learn about that here in just a little bit. And he wrote on 1 June 1937, "The post is this day abandoned, and the squadron takes up its march for Fort Leavenworth. It has been delayed until this date in order that the grass might be sufficiently high to afford grazing for the horses, as corn cannot be had on some parts of the route." So the very last communique sent from Fort Des Moines number 1 deals with the dragoons. He's not talking about the infantry, he's talking about the dragoon soldiers whose horses need something to eat. The most notable dragoon expedition through Iowa was the 1835 route. They left Fort Des Moines number 1 in June of 1835. The actual expedition took about 7 weeks. And when we think about horse and buggy or horse travel in a pretty much unsurveyed, don't want to say unexplored because Native Americans had traveled around and knew the area, but 7 weeks to get all the way up into northern Minnesota and back at that period of time, to me is amazing, given the fact that they don't have very accurate maps, which we'll touch on here in a minute. They leave Fort Des Moines. Their goal was to arrive at the intersection of the Des Moines, the confluence of the Des Moines and the Raccoon Rivers. Well, they ended up running into the South Skunk River, given present-day maps, not sure what they called it then, and they thought that that was what they wanted. So they started following that to the northwest, and they finally realized, I think we're on the wrong trail here. We're on the wrong body of water. So they end up turning and heading to the northeast, and then they get up to an area, mentions it there, they get up to a place, Wabash's Village, and there, using inaccurate maps, they march to what they think is another river, and then 9 days later they say, whoops, this isn't where we think it is either, and so they turn around. It's kind of like flight school. If you don't know where you are, turn around and go back to some area that you do know where it is so you can find your way home. And so same thing, they turned around, they headed southwest, they regained their position on they crossed and came down the western side of the Des Moines River, and then they ended up making it back 7 weeks later, riding back into Fort Des Moines No. 1 on the Mississippi River. The gentleman to the left is Lieutenant Albert Lee. Now, if you look at his uniform and say, gee, that looks kind of light, you're right. If it was a color image, it would be gray. He fought for the Confederacy later in the Civil War. But Albert Lee went along on this journey, and when he got back, went out to Philadelphia, met with a printer, a guy named Tanner, and he printed this little book. The original is only about 3 by 5 inches, kind of a bluish green cover, very fragile, almost like a small notebook, and it was about 50-some pages, and he just filled that with a glowing review of what he found in what he called the Iowa District. He is credited with giving Iowa its name. In fact, the State Historical Society in 1936 reprinted in larger format his journal and diary with some historical and interpretive, explanatory, contextual material on the route, why it was important, what he did. But he was one of the first ones to call the Iowa District the Iowa District. And they printed, I think, about 500 of these. There was a map that was in the original. I wasn't able to find a copy of that. I'm sure it's out there, but I just haven't found one yet. And 500 of them ended up in a box on a steamboat that caught some kind of a snag on the Ohio River. So they may have been pitched into the Ohio River. Nobody knows. There aren't very many. I think in 1936 there were only a handful of his original reports left in libraries or archives that could be found. So you can see the title there, the notes on the Wisconsin Territory, particularly with reference to the Iowa District or Black Hawk Purchase, Lieutenant Albert Lee. Now, because the 1836 expedition went up into Minnesota, ironically, the guy that did the most for encouraging settlement in Iowa has a community named for him in Minnesota. Visitors always get kind of a chuckle out of that. But this is just one sentence that gives you the idea of the positive things that he had to say. He said, in every part of this whole district, beautiful rivers and creeks are to be found, whose transparent waters are perpetually renewed by the springs from which they flow. And then he goes on to talk about how every river and stream that he saw seems to be teeming with fish, how there are abundant minerals and iron, the crops that grow here, not a lot of population. He mentioned bears and elk and buffalo. And he makes the prophetic statement that in time with settlement, these animals will disappear. Okay? He was right. When was the last time someone saw a buffalo running out in a cornfield? No, they were not hunted to extinction, but certainly pushed out of their Iowa habitats. The 1835 trail, this map shows the departure from Fort Des Moines No. 1. They missed the junction of the rivers down here, realized their error, head this way, missed that river, realize they've made another mistake, and they come back down the west side. And again, all that in about 7 or 8 weeks. That's a long, I don't know how many. I should talk to the map guy at Camp Dodge and say, how long was this route? He could probably pinpoint that and tell us how many miles. Several hundred miles, I would say, easily. In a number of different communities along the route, most of us are familiar with dragoons or come into contact with that term because of the signs that the DOT put up, I think maybe 10 or 15, well, 20 or 25 years ago. And there are other communities that have these bronze plaques that were put up by the Iowa Daughters of the American Revolution in the 1930s, close to the centennial of the original route. Those are affixed to different boulders or cement blocks in different locations in Iowa as you head to the north. All the expeditions that were undertaken by the Dragoons, that one is probably the most famous and has received the most attention and has the most written about it. Another expedition, summer of 1842, James Allen, who, as you know, has some contact with and a role to play in the history of early Des Moines. That name comes up in the old history books and a lot of the published literature. One Company I patrols the interior of the territory. They marched all the way from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas to Fort Atkinson, which isn't a quick jaunt either. They were there to sort of show their muskets, show their sabers, a show of force at a treaty signing with the Sauk and Fox in 1842 that would open up the eastern central half of Iowa to white settlement. 1843, Company I from the 1st Dragoons and Company F of the 1st Infantry, they end up arriving together at the same time at the confluence of the Raccoon and the Des Moines rivers. And we know the story there. They end up constructing a fort, which is originally, because they saw these animals on the way there, they wanted to name Fort Des Moines No. 2 Fort Raccoon. And when they sent that paperwork into the War Department, General Scott, Winfield Scott, or probably, yeah, I think he was General of the Army then, Winfield Scott says, no, that does not sound very military, find a new name. Well, Fort Des Moines No. 1 had been closed, so they named it Fort Des Moines No. 2. They maybe could have named it something else, but it ended up being Fort Des Moines No. 2, which, as we know, is the origin of the current metro area of Des Moines. There was a map done in the 1850s that showed, it was pen and ink drawing, but it showed one of the officers' quarters at Fort Des Moines No. 2. And they had, officer would stay on one side and there was a mirror copy of that on the other side. And that map shows one of those intact barracks buildings. When the Army sold everything off, they sold the buildings too. So some of the early settlers, as you know, picked up the buildings, cabins, moved them, occupied what was left over from the garrison. This photo is a photograph of one of those barracks buildings, one of the officers' barracks buildings. And they had a little breezeway in between. And that's one of the earliest structures, one of the earliest buildings constructed in the Des Moines metro area. This image that you're all familiar with was done about 1898, 1899. Acquaintance of mine, Kathy Gorley, has done a number of things in the employ of the State Historical Society of Iowa here in Des Moines. She did a lot of work on this period of time in some of the early Indian agents and settlers. And she said that she could not find, she went to the National Archive, dug through all their files, there is not a period map, meaning 1843 to 1846, there is not a period map of Fort Des Moines No. 2 known to exist. One of the things that they discovered, the archaeologists, when they widened Martin Luther King Parkway, and they were digging where the old fort used to exist, they realized that these are relatively where this map, made perhaps from memory by a former soldier of the garrison, is accurate. But the enlisted barracks actually don't run in a right angle as is suggested on some of these other maps. That the enlisted barracks actually ran off at a bit of an angle, a bit of an acute angle. And when the archaeologists were digging along the right-of-way from Martin Luther King Parkway, they ended up finding the limestone fireplaces and the hearths from the enlisted men's barracks. So that also convinced them that there was more of an acute angle between those two. Not to mire things down here in archaeology, but that's probably one historian described Fort Des Moines, although it was garrisoned for a very short time, 3 years, probably one of the most important forts in Iowa's history. 1844, I put this in here, there's not a whole lot to talk about here. They went all the way up into northern Minnesota and come back, but sometimes the historical record is pretty sparse. There's no record, no detailed report, no one's journal, no one's letters, no one's diaries survived from that expedition other than to know that it took place. Another important one was in 1844. Captain Allen realized that a lot of the maps that they were marching around in, we used the 1835 expedition, for example, weren't very accurate. So his intent was to go on a lengthy trip around upper northern Iowa country, or Iowa territory by that time, and find out, create as accurate a map as he could. I'm just going to quote this here. He goes, "So little was known of the true geography of the country to be passed over that it was impossible to define the route beforehand with exactness. And I was of course embarrassed in some degree to estimate the time we ought to be out and the distance we might have to march. Therefore I made provision for a march of about 800 miles and an absence of 70 to 80 days, assuming that many days might be employed in exploring the country near the line of route." One of the maps that was made by Captain Allen and his surveyors and cartographers still exists at the National Archive. Kathy Gorley, who I mentioned earlier, she found this out there when she was working on her master's thesis. And this appeared in a copy or an edition of the Palimpsest, Iowa Heritage Illustrated magazine, and that's where I got the copy from there. It's hard to see, but you can see the dotted lines where his route went. And you can still see the Sioux, the neutral strip, they called it, the Sioux on one side and the Sauk and Fox on the other. There was an article in the Annals of Iowa Journal of History, and someone looked at that map and made a little cleaner copy. Again, it's not very big on this screen, but this one you can see a little more clearly the route that they took. At the last Dragoon expedition through Iowa, 2 companies, and there were reports that there was a group of Indians in Canada that were crossing the border and hunting and causing problems for the Sioux. And so they explored that, again, getting back to that mission to provide security and police borders, acting as frontier policemen. Took them oftentimes, not every year, but oftentimes as far north as the Canadian border. Ended up making it up there, and they returned to their different forts, companies B and I. This one recreates the travels of that last trip, a trip in 1845. There is not an actual map, so based on the diary of an unknown dragoon, it's in an archive, they were able to retrace the steps, again, given some natural features that were described in that journal, and come up with an approximate path of the route. In summary, the Dragoons accomplished the missions that they were assigned with, which simply is enforcing treaty restrictions, removing illegal settlers, meaning Indians that transgressed back into their earlier homes. But also I found, reading through the literature for tonight's presentation, 4 examples of Dragoons locating cabins in fences in farms on their way to being developed ahead of where they should have been. They shouldn't have been on that land, and the Dragoons burned them. In one of the instances, they caught the guy there, the squatter there, and they said, "Okay, pack your bags because we're burning this cabin and your fences." And so I gave him a chance to pack his belongings. They chased him out, and they burned the cabin and the fence to the ground. So oftentimes, don't want to blame Hollywood, but a lot of times we see the images of the cavalry riding through villages, shooting women and children and things like that. But in Iowa, that never happened. The Dragoons did is honest and as faithful a role as frontier policemen for both parties as was possible. And again, I cite the examples of them torching settlers' cabins that were in areas where they were not supposed to be. I included this because Fort Atkinson was the third or fourth oldest fort in Iowa, and the Dragoons operated out of there on several of their marches. This photo was taken, I think, about 1900, and if anyone's had a chance to get up to Fort Atkinson today, they've reconstructed a lot of it. They've conducted a lot of archaeology there, recovered a lot of neat military-associated artifacts. They have rendezvous days where they have reenactors that come up, and they have people dressed as dragoons with their horses. So if you want to explore that in more of a three-dimensional, people that can tell you exactly what style of belt and what model hat and what model musket, those are the folks to talk. The 1st and 2nd Dragoon Regiments, when we went to war with Mexico in April 1846, they're pulled off the frontier. Iowa volunteer companies garrison Fort Atkinson and garrison Fort Dodge, and the Dragoons go on to fight in the Mexican War. When that's finished, they remain on the roster until 1861, when the Union Army mobilizes for the Civil War, and mounted rifles, mounted riflemen, and dragoons, they create cavalry regiments, and they say we're not going to have groups with similar missions and dissimilar names. So everybody is now going to be called cavalry. And so in the American Army, the Dragoons come to an end in the first year of the Civil War. The Dragoons in Iowa, there's a great a great deal of scholarship and a very rich history on that topic.
To learn more about the Dragoons in Iowa, you can look up any of the literature you see listed here.